Right. Good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to our December capacity building webinar. We're so glad that you could join us today. My name is Ashanti McGee, and I'll be your host for this session. And before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge our American Sign Language interpreters, Mariah Garcia and Tosh Terry, who will be with us for the duration of this webinar. We are committed to making this a welcoming and accessible space for all. We'll go over a few more accessibility features in just a moment. As mentioned, we have ASL interpreters today, and to keep them visible, you can pin their video by clicking the three dots in the corner of their video, of your video, and selecting pin. For Zoom norms, we encourage you to use the chat and to share your thoughts and connect with fellow attendees. Please be respectful and constructive in your comments. Okay. And we'll also have a dedicated question and answer session with our guest speaker after their presentation. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat as we go along, and we'll best address them. Okay. And as we're getting started, I'd like to hand this over to Sierra Scott to introduce our guest.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you, Ashanti, for bringing us in. I am thrilled to be able to introduce our speaker for this month's capacity building webinar, which is our own Caleb Rainey. He is the Director of Development here at Creative West, where he leads fundraising efforts across a wide range of revenue streams. He brings more than a decade of experience in fundraising, philanthropy, and nonprofit programming, having begun his career in the arts and expanded his work into areas including racial and social justice, Indigenous rights and representation, climate, democracy, and higher education. Caleb has successfully led fundraising initiatives for both local and national organizations with expertise spanning major gifts, individual giving, campaigns, grants, and corporate partnerships. He holds an MA in Cultural Studies from San Diego University and a BA in Women's and Ethnic Studies from the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. So thank you so much again, Caleb, for presenting for this webinar, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Sierra. And it's a joy to get to share space with this amazing group. I'm excited to share what I can about the field of philanthropy, which I know is a difficult one and can be challenging, but we'll talk through some of the skills and tools we can use to be successful and build confidence in our efforts around fundraising. Next slide. Well, that's happening. I wanted to sort of set the stage with thinking through some of the common fears and barriers we all have when engaging in fundraising. I mean, most of us didn't grow up asking folks to support things. It's a skill that is often difficult. And some of the barriers and fears that we can hold are fear of being told no or imposing on someone, like we're crossing a line. There's also justified sort of feelings around being conflicted over the source or history of wealth, which is very fraught in the United States. We can bring differential experiences and mores regarding talking about money from the ways we grew up or cultural backgrounds. We can also be unfamiliar with the sheer scale of wealth. For example, I grew up working class, and so really didn't have a great concept of just how much wealth is out there, how it moves. That wasn't part of my upbringing, or I wasn't exposed to that. And then fear over lack of formal training. There's not a lot of degree programs, right, in fundraising. It's sort of an unregulated field, and it can be hard to know if you're getting the right information or skill set. Next slide. So I wanted to sort of ground us in confronting some of those fears and barriers or reframing them. One is really thinking about fundraising is inviting someone to live their values in a material way. So it's not necessarily, while money is often shifting in a fundraising relationship, right? It's really an opportunity for someone to really step in to their values, which is a wonderful invitation. Most people want to express their values. Um, Brings us to the second point. Most people want to give to positive and impactful work, particularly that impacts their community or ways that they're able to see. Um, Really, feelings around the source of money, while justified, is really sitting with the recognition that most money in the United States is pretty dirty if we look at the history of its accumulation and generation. Really sitting with your level of comfort around the source of money you're comfortable taking, but recognizing it is fairly arbitrary. I mean, Edgar Villanueva, who's the principal director at Decolonizing Wealth, has put out some guidelines around thinking about, how long between the original harm and the wealth, essentially how long has the money been washed through either foundation giving or that sort of thing. Um, is the harm still happening? So thinking like Ford Foundation's not necessarily burning down rubber plantations anymore in the Amazon, while Amazon itself might be engaging in contemporary harm. So thinking about lines around that, but really sitting with what the values are that you're going to bring around the sources of money. And then really thinking about money as a tool to build the world we want, right? So it's not necessarily just financial resources. It is, in effect, this thing that we're asking for is a tool that other people have that help us collectively achieve a goal that we all want. Next slide. I also want us to consider that there are many people and organizations who have way more than we often realize. So assume resources are available. I will give a quick example. I was a young development director in a contemporary arts center in California, and we were hosting an event, and at the time I was sort of asking for 500 or $1,000. Our budget at the time was 650,000, so smaller to mid-size. And we had an event where this couple who I was talking about a $500 to $1,000 gift, come to find out, they had a private plane that they took to Sacramento to watch basketball games regularly, right? And they sort of funded these large exhibitions at the zoo. And it was really that recognition that there are people and institutions that have that sort of wealth that at the time I didn't really conceptualize, right? And so really thinking through that there are resources available. And then finally, when we're thinking about the skill development, the Oregon State University actually did some research, and only 17% of fundraisers actually learned their skill set through a formal program. Most of us have been winging it, including myself, for 10 years and just learning as we go. And so this is really a field that anyone can learn. Next slide. I want to be conscious of time, but I want us to take maybe 3 to 5 minutes to just reflect. You don't need to put it in the chat necessarily, but thinking about what your money story is. It's a little different than thinking about necessarily what it is for you personally. It's thinking about sort of a larger picture around money, since that's essentially what fundraising is going to be engaged in. So think about questions like, what ideas do you hold about money? What stories about money did you grow up with? What values do you bring to money? And what experiences, as you've gone through the world, sort of inform those views? I think this is often an important exercise that gets underutilized, because when we're engaging in fundraising, we can often bring sort of our personal relationship to our personal finances to that work, when really this is about a much larger conversation, that we want to be aware of the sorts of barriers we might be holding to engage in something that's actually not about us at all, but about a much larger mission, which the donor also understands. So I invite us to spend just a handful of minutes. Why don't we we'll sort of restart the presentation at 3:18 Pacific. So just 5 minutes to sort of sit with that as we think about beginning a fundraising journey or amplifying our fundraising journey, thinking about the stories we hold around money itself. All right, thank you so much for engaging in that exercise. I think that's going to provide some lens that we can look at as we move through the rest of this presentation. Next slide. So I first want to get us oriented around the different funding streams that are available. Oftentimes, I find that when we're talking about fundraising, what we really are talking about is foundations and grant writing, where fundraising is actually much more diverse than just that single revenue stream. And so I want to outline a few different revenue streams that are available to nonprofits. So we have individual donors. And those can be broken down in a lot of different ways. For the case of this presentation, I have major donors and grassroots donors. So major donors are those who can part with a large amount of money, usually at once or in a short amount of time. Grassroots donors can give smaller amounts of money, perhaps monthly or one time. With larger organizations that are like with more sophisticated fundraising departments, you might have plan gifts, which are for including the foundation, the organization in bequests or sort of life insurance policies. You might have mid-level donors. Um, so you have individual donors. You have endowed foundations. And when I say endowed foundations, it's really to separate them from community foundations. And I'll give an example. We'll use Ford again. So Ford Foundation, it really does their granting out of their endowment. Essentially, the interest they earn off of their endowment, which is, very old, is what they use to make their granting out of. Community foundations, on the other hand, like a Seattle Community Foundation, for example, that is a collection of usually high net worth individuals who have picked the Seattle Community Foundation to give a large amount of money to. So the Seattle Community Foundation is the actual nonprofit, and they park their funds there in things called donor advised funds. The difference between the two, other than they're just machinations, is that for the Ford Foundation, you are going to interact with a program officer who's going to walk you through the process, or you're going to apply for a grant. At a community foundation, they have more akin to what they call donor advisors who actually work with the high net worth people that put their funds in the community foundation, in this case, the Seattle Community Foundation, who advise those donors on where to give. The donors actually count on them to make recommendations. That really changes how you're going to engage with a community foundation whose staff is usually forbidden from outright fundraising to the donors who've given their funds to that community foundation. So someone at the Seattle Community Foundation can't go to Joe Schmo and say, I think you should give to ABC organization. However, when Joe Schmo, who has an interest in arts, goes to the person at Seattle Community Foundation and goes, I'm looking for an arts organization to invest in, it's time to give that time of year, they can say, great, ABC organization is a great option. And so it works sort of differently. Then we have what we'll call funder collaboratives, and those can be broken down in different ways, but essentially those are coming together of either foundations around a particular issue. Maybe they want to look at the issue of arts and climate, and so they're pulling together arts and climate funders that are going to pool money to do that very specific thing. Or you might have what we might call donor collectives, which can also be called donor collaboratives, where high net worth donors get together and decide they want to fund a particular issue or topic, and they will have more impact together. And both of those can give money to nonprofit organizations. And then finally, you'll have corporate and small business partners. And really, one of the key differences between corporate giving and the other revenue streams is corporate giving is often looking for a benefit, whether that is to their reputation, expanding a client base, building deeper ties in a community. It's a little bit different than how other revenue streams are just sort of giving the money and without that sort of expectation in return, which makes this revenue stream a little unique, but can be really successful and mutually beneficial when done thoughtfully. Next slide. I now want to sort of build our collective language as we talk about the sorts of donors or potential donors that we hold in an organization. Really getting that categorization right is going to help a lot when thinking about fundraising or stewardship, concepts we'll cover in depth later in the presentation. So we have what we'll call prospective donors, and those are individuals or organizations that have been identified as a potential contributor. So we'll use Joe Schmo again, right? We know he likes arts. We know he has funding, but he has not given to ABC organization yet. So Joe Schmo's prospective at that point. Current donors are those who have given to the organization within the last 18 months. So that would qualify them as current. They are current partners with the organization and up to date with their financial investments. Then you might have lapsed donor, which are individuals or organizations that don't renew their gift within 18 months of the original gift. So Joe Schmo gives in December and he doesn't give again until September of the following year. He would be lapsed at that point. And then past donors are those who don't renew their gift after their initial gift for longer than 18 months. And then they're considered past donors that have to be really essentially re-engaged. Next slide. This concept of donor moves management is sort of foundational in the field of fundraising. It really helps us think about how we're going to build relationships and grow our donor bases through a cyclical process. And so I want to go through the different steps that we take. We begin with the stage of acquisition, which is really identifying the prospective new donors for your organization and then beginning to make first contact with them, right? So maybe in the case of Joe Schmo, you've done research, you've decided he's a good prospect, and you sent him an email inviting him to a meeting. Cultivation is the stage where you're building a relationship with the prospective donor. So say you're wanting to go with the Z Foundation and you're needing to build a relationship with a program officer. That's essentially cultivation. A note that's really important to always maintain is that the relationship between a fundraiser and a donor is always made up of three constituencies. So you have the fundraiser, you have the actual donor, and then you have the organization, right? That you're not building necessarily a one-to-one relationship, you're building a one-to-two relationship because ideally you want that funder to love the organization and stick with it regardless if things in your life change and you're moving on. That's really how we build sustainable revenue streams for the organizations we love. You then will move to solicitation, which is inviting the prospective donor to make a gift to your organization. So this is usually the stage that gives people the heebie-jeebies, where you actually are asking for money, but we'll sort of talk about ways to do that. And then we move into stewardship. Really, this is about expressing gratitude to the donor who has now become a current donor. And you continue to build a relationship with the donor, right? So it's not a transactional process. It's one of continual relationship building. Next slide. We then have retention. My two senses, retention and stewardship, overlap dramatically, but I'm keeping them separate because that's the theory. But really coupling this with strategic follow-ups and individualized outreach, right? To keep the person involved in the organization. It is actually 7 times cheaper to keep a donor than it is to find a donor. And so really putting a heavy emphasis on relationship building and stewardship is going to save you a lot of time and money. And then finally, upgrading. So once you know a donor is committed, right? Maybe they've given once or twice, they're sticking with you, they're interested in your programs, you're building a good relationship. It's really time to start thinking about ways to boost their engagement and lifetime giving. Maybe you're asking for a higher level of gift, or you're asking for a 3-year grant when you had only originally received a 2-year grant. You're thinking about larger ways that the donor who is now part of your community can get involved. Next slide. I want to talk a little bit about how we can build a fundraising tool chest to make all of this easy, because I know it can get really complicated and building relationships take time. So I want to talk about how we manage that workflow and how we can sort of optimize parts of it to make things easier and more efficient. You want to begin by having a case statement that really outlines big things like your organization's mission or vision, history, your programs, your impact, what have you accomplished, and ideally future plans that the donor is able to understand how to get involved and why you're asking for funds in the first place. Where are you hoping to accomplish? You also might want to have program-specific overview. So you'd have a general case statement and then maybe drill down a bit more into specific programs that you offer and really outlining their activities, histories, and accomplishments, and desired growth. Like, where are you trying to scale them? There are multiple examples online, many of them good, none of them sort of ideal, right? So take some time to figure out what matches your capacity and really feels good to you. But those are sort of some general outlines to think about when building a case statement. This does not need to be an exceptional long document, though. It can be 2 or 3 pages, or a page. But really, you want to give the donor a really clear idea of the work you're doing and why it matters and how they can get involved, a pathway for them to connect. Um, you want to make sure that you have a database of some sort to be recording funder information, their names, their contact information. When did you last talk to them? If you're managing 30 relationships, that's going to be important. I need it. Um, and really recording their gift information. If they've given to you, how much did they give? When did they give it? So that you're not asking too soon and you're ensuring that you're expressing gratitude correctly. Um, you don't need a fancy database. I have worked in Excel and Google Sheets multiple times. They definitely can do this. But there are other tools out there if your organization has more resources. You also want to think about building an acknowledgement letter template. And this is a letter where you thank the donor for the gift to your organization. In the letter, you want to outline the date and value of the gift. You want to make sure to outline your EIN or employer identification number and your address, and let them know the impact their gift is having by sharing some of your recent work or accomplishments. If you have a 501c3 designation, this is a required activity because they'll use it on their taxes at the end of the year. I want to add a note here that when you send an acknowledgement letter, like the template cuts down on a lot of time, but you should always include, even if it's just a sticky note, some sort of personalized note on top of the acknowledgement letter. You don't want it to sound too templatey. So I think it's often best practice, even if it's a short email, some way that you're ensuring that the person knows that it's not just a template. You recognize who they are and sort of what their interest is. Next slide. One thing that can be really useful is building a fundraising script. We often write differently than how we talk. And so when you're building sort of your written materials, they don't always translate for how you would talk to a donor over coffee or over a live Zoom meeting. And so really building out a fundraising script that has your key talking points, verbal explanations of your programs and mission. Maybe you memorize sort of parts of that so that the conversation can flow easily. But it's really nice to have a reference base. You also want to think about building a fundraising plan, a yearly fundraising plan that really outlines things like how much money do you want to raise in a year? What sources do you think the money's going to come from? The strategies you're going to use to get it, whether that's events or campaigns or one-to-one visits, a timeline for executing the plan. So really looking at the different things you might have to do over the year. And then it can be helpful to think about when you think funds are going to be received. So those are going to be projections. You don't have direct control over that, but that can be helpful in thinking through things like cash flow or when things can happen. Another really helpful tool is what we'll call an intro email template. And that's where you have an email that introduces you and your organization, briefly outlines your mission and programs, and includes a meeting request, right? So say you're at an event and you meet 3 high net worth donors. You don't necessarily want to have to craft original emails from scratch for all 3 of those. And especially if you're on a small team or if you're the only fundraising person. So one of the ways you can do that is build a simple template email that can be customized and has some of those basics outlined already. I do want to note, though, that after that initial meeting is secured, emails can no longer be customized because a relationship is happening, right? And so you're going to have to customize all the future emails to the person, but it can be helpful in doing the initial outreach and really cut down on time and allow you to outreach to more people than building emails from scratch for those initial outreach emails. Next slide. You also want to think about creating a stewardship and retention plan, right? So that's going to outline how you plan to continue building a relationship with your donor, such as like, when are you going to call them? How many meetings do you plan to take in a year? Are you going to send them the annual report? Are they going to be invited to events? Which ones? Really outlining that. You also want to include planning to ask them for their next gift, right? So in their stewardship plan, you want to make sure this is building towards asking for a renewal gift, if they're a current donor. You also want to think about building a grants calendar. You can do this in Google Calendar that helps outline when letters of inquiry are due, applications are due, mid-cycle reports, and final reports are due. This can also actually be helpful for helping you chart your stewardship plan. So you get calendar ticklers for when you're supposed to reach out to donors or send a thank you card. You want to sort of think about your method of categorizing donors. So if you remember, we talked about sort of major donors, grassroots donors, these different categorizations, thinking about how sophisticated you want those categorizations to be at your organization, but ensuring you have buckets, because different types of donors are going to have different needs and different expectations. And it sort of alleviates you from needing to think of individual strategies as a whole. I mean, everyone's going to need some level of customization, but this can really help cut down on some of that and save time, especially if you have smaller staffs. And then you want to think about doing an event template that is good for virtual. A lot of donor meetings now are taking place over Zoom and in person, whether that's like a small dinner party or an exhibition opening or those sorts of things that outline a timeline for the event, the tasks that need to be performed, who's responsible for them. There are some great templates online for that as well. Next slide. We're now going to talk a little bit, now that we've like built our tool chest and we have our donor moves management, we're going to talk about the actual process of how do we find these people who are going to employ these tools on. We're going to start with prospecting. So again, prospecting really means that you're locating and you're researching potential donors for your organization. It is the absolute first step to securing a gift. And you should really think about prospecting with a combination of ambition. So you don't want to assume resources are out there. You want to ask for what you need, and pairing that with realism. And what I mean by that is really taking a good look at who's already in your network. Does it have the capacity to do that? How is the economy doing at the moment? These sorts of things that sort of can balance out ambition. I want to underscore that research and data are the lifeblood of fundraising. You have to keep track of all of these relationships and all of these engagements in order to really be effective in this work. So I really want to highlight the importance of good data keeping in a good database. Next slide. So some prospecting practices that can be helpful in locating potential donors are some reviewing your existing network. Who in your existing network is a potential donor? And what I mean by that is maybe you've run a program and the person who participated in the program at the time didn't have money, but they've gone on to get money. Could be a great prospect, right? Your board can be a great prospect. Your doctor might be a great prospect. Who's already moving in your circle that matches that idea of a donor who has an interest in what you're doing or in the field and has capacity to give you resources. You also want to examine the funders of aligned organizations by reviewing their annual reports. This is a common practice. It is not viewed as sort of taking from anyone. If organizations didn't want you to know who was funding them, they wouldn't put it in their annual reports. So I've yet to meet a fundraiser who doesn't do this, and it's profoundly helpful because when you're looking at organizations that are similar to yours, you're going to find funders who are interested in that. They're interested in those strategies. They're interested in those types of programs. And oftentimes funders give to lots of different organizations. And so you really want to, that can be a great source of information. In sort of in line with that, also considering attending another organization's fundraiser, which sounds sort of counterintuitive, but when you do that, you get the opportunity to interact with a donor community that you don't have access to otherwise. You might get a table with potential donors that you get to talk about the work you're doing. Inevitably, they're going to ask. And so that can also be a great place to meet people. Also going to your museums or libraries or exhibitions and looking at their donor walls. Oftentimes there's going to be bricks, maybe it's on an arch, maybe there's an art piece. But the people who give heavily in your city, I can guarantee their names are in these civic institutions. I know the names in my city. And so really looking at who is supporting arts and cultural infrastructure in your city and historically has. Next slide. Other ways that you can find prospects is making sure your community foundation knows about your work through things like sending them your annual report or your case statement with a nice cover letter is really helpful so that when Joe Schmo goes to the person at Seattle Community Foundation, they're able to say the great work that you're doing and where Joe Schmo should invest. You also want to think about mapping out your corporate landscape in your area, like who is headquartered in your city or county. They often give heavily to where they're headquartered. That tends to get the lion's share of corporate giving. And also mapping out your small business infrastructure, whether that's just a walking tour or even looking at the business journal in your area. You also want to think about where your organization spends money. Vendors can also be a source of revenue, right? So if you've been paying an insurance agent for 3 years for your organization, it could be a great opportunity to ask them to support your end of year campaign, for example, thinking about those sorts of non-traditional revenue streams. Again, your board of directors and their networks are great prospect pools, and you really want to tap into them. Boards are so important for building your prospective donor list. And if you have the budget, tools like Foundation Directory, which helps you navigate the foundation world and be able to sort of filter for your particular donor matches, or Wealth Engine, which helps you find high net worth donors in your area or in the areas that you serve, can be really helpful. If you don't have the budget, you might want to check out your local library to see if they have a subscription that you can use. Next slide. Finally, you want to do some research on the political donors in your area. I think this is an often underutilized strategy, but people who give heavily to political causes also give to nonprofit causes. They have varied interests. And you don't want to leave that on the table. You can actually run names through the Federal Election Commission website to get an idea of how much they give and to whom to see if you could see if their values are aligning with yours. And then you can even do things like attending political fundraisers, which are often small, but really tend to skew more wealthy to also get introductions to this group. I would also recommend researching the endowed foundations in your city and in your state. Again, when a foundation's headquartered in an area, they tend to disproportionately give money in that area. So if you're based there, you're probably going to have a leg up on organizations that aren't. And then finally, attending funder conferences is another great way of gaining access. And even if you can attend funder conferences, getting the list of people who sponsored the conference or who were sitting on the organizing committee can also be really helpful in expanding your prospect pool. Next slide. I now want to pivot. Now that we're sort of expanding our prospect pool, I want to talk a little bit about our cultivation and stewardship strategies. I always put cultivation and stewardship together because they're both essentially relationship building. And we have a variety of options on how to do that. Probably the gold standard is going to be one-on-one meetings, right? Whether that's over Zoom or over coffee, really building that human-centered time with a potential donor. I do want to underline that's not possible for everyone. If you have a small team, you're managing a large group of donors or prospects. And so you're going to have to display a range of strategies to sort of manage larger groups of people. Event invitations are another great way to sort of build those relationships, inviting them to programs or gallery openings. Um, a personal note or phone call can go a long way. Just checking in, or maybe they mentioned they were not feeling well the last time you saw them. Those sorts of human touches can go a long way to moving the relationship forward. You also want to consider sending them interesting or impactful information about your organization or, importantly, your line of work. I think this doesn't happen enough, right? We're used to boosting our organization, but say if you're in the arts field and The Guardian put out a really great interesting article on the particular art type of art you're working on or type of program you do, and the donor who's giving to you cares about those things as well, it's a great opportunity to spark a conversation about what's happening in the wider field and help develop a stronger, deeper relationship. And then you want to think about donor recognition, right? So are they listed in the annual report? Do they get an announcement at the exhibition opening? What ways are you recognizing and elevating them for their generosity? This applies only to current donors. We tend to reserve that distinction for folks who are actually invested in our organizations. Next slide. Other ideas are an annual report or impact report that highlight the people whose resources help make that possible. You can also think about introducing them to your colleagues, like your board members or even your program participants. If you're running an artist workshop and they've really enjoyed their time there, that can be a great opportunity to bring in a donor to see the work you're doing and hear from the people impacted by it. You also want to think about care calls. I kind of view these as a little bit different than just the personal touches. These care calls have become important in an age of climate change and pandemic and these other things that are often really impactful across society, right? Or in a particular area. Making sure that we're checking in on people when things are difficult. This was a lesson I learned deeply working in the climate space, right? It's so much more than just climate. It's also they're living through climate change. And so making sure that we're showing care. And then finally, you can invite them into special behind the scenes access, whether that's watching an art build or looking at an exhibition being put up. There's opportunities to sort of bring them closer to the work. Next slide. Finally, I want to highlight a really core truth in fundraising and encourage us all to really remember this, which is people give to people first and organizations second. You could have the cure for cancer, and if you don't have a relationship with that person or they don't like you or trust you, chances are they're not going to be inspired by your pitch or hang out long enough to know that you even have the cure for cancer. Cultivation and stewardship activities are really about building the relationship and ensuring that the donor is seen as a person that is committed to your organization. No one likes to be treated like an ATM machine, no matter how wealthy they may be. Next slide. I want to spend just a handful of minutes on the topic of membership programs and sponsorship tiers. I think can be great tools for not only grouping similar communities of donors together, but also helping streamline stewardship activities. And what I mean by that is if you have a membership program, everyone's going to get the same thing at the same membership level. And so there's less need to think through the different customizations. And the great thing about that is the people joining already know what the benefits are. So there's sort of an alignment right out of the gate. You want to think about ensuring that a membership program has some type of perk, and it can be small. And ideally, the membership program will have various levels. So if you have a membership program maybe of 25, 50, and 100, at 100, you're going to maybe have more perks or a better perk than you would at 50, than you would at 25. And so there's going to be a descending level to that. And if you create membership programs, it also sort of allows you to outline the amount of money you're hoping the person will give out of the gate. and avoid sort of having to think too much about the anxiety around asking someone for funds, because you're really sort of outlining a member program that you're wanting them to join. They understand the fee. It's a familiar structure for a lot of people. And so that can be helpful in navigating that. Next slide. Sponsorships are a little different than membership programs. Membership programs are sort of evergreen. They can happen for years and years and years. Sponsorships tend to be time bound. So think of like an exhibition, right? There's going to be a start and an end, and you're sponsoring that, or a season. Um, and within that, for a sponsorship, again, you're going to have tiers, generally from highest to lowest. So you might have, we'll say, like a Ruby, Sapphire, and Diamond. And Ruby gets, if Ruby's at the top, Ruby's going to get a little bit more. If you're thinking about a corporate donor, maybe their logo's bigger, or it's on the title wall. Sapphire might be mid, and then you'll have Diamond, still getting something valuable, but not at the same level as Sapphire Ruby. Um, this can be a really helpful way, particularly with corporate donors, can be really helpful in engaging them. Next slide. I just want to outline very quickly just a few resources that are going to be available. This, I believe we're sending out this presentation, so you can find the Oregon State University sort of it's a blog with a study on navigating fundraising challenges. You can look at the donor moves management outline from Donor Search. Candid's a great resource. I believe they have some free options, but many libraries will probably have that available. Fundraising for Social Change by Kim Klein. She was deeply involved in social justice focused fundraising. Former executive director of, I believe, GLSEN, which was a national LGBTQ student group. And Fundraising for Social Change is great, gives a lot of the basics and a lot of tactics. The Association of Fundraising Professionals is a professional group that often does helpful overviews and tactics, etc. They also have a conference. Next slide. You also can think about doing planning and implementing your major gifts campaign by Susan Irwin Wells, which is an excellent primer on just thinking about fundraising campaigns in general, and has a great workbook to sort of do some of this. Chronicle of Philanthropy is a great resource and often is helping plug people into what's happening in the larger field. Lilly School of Philanthropy out of, I believe, Indiana State University is one of the only sort of academic nodes for philanthropy and does some great research and studies that are I believe, often most of the time free. And then it is a report from the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund. It was done in 2016 called Beyond Fundraising, What Does It Mean to Build a Culture of Philanthropy? That is really helpful in thinking through sort of the strategies and cultural ideas around building a thriving donor community. And I think that's it. Next slide. Yeah. And I think finally, just remembering that you've got this. I think fundraising can often be really mysterious, a little scary, and it's not. So really moving forward with confidence, I think is both earned and warranted. And that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Caleb. That's a fantastic presentation. We will be sending this out to everyone who attended and registered. So you will receive all of those resources. We have some time for Q&A now, so we'll move into that. If you have any questions, you can drop them in the chat and I will facilitate that, or you are also welcome to raise your hand and unmute and ask your questions aloud. And I'm going to actually start with a question that was asked previously during the presentation, which is, why do you use the 18-month marker instead of the 12-month marker for funder statuses?
That's a good question because I also thought it was super confusing. I think part of it is to keep it from looking too corporatized, right? Because it's not necessarily like a bill that one pays each year in the same way. So it allows sort of a more of a human sort of timeline. Someone might It also, like logistically, if you have them in a member program or you're working with them on something and maybe they don't give until like 14 months, it doesn't look real good to kick them out of the member program at 12 months. I mean, they may have had something going on. And so that sort of provides a little bit of cushion for just life. And so you don't have to necessarily remove them from different things.
Great, thank you. Another question in the chat. For those of us who are understaffed, are there any tools or software programs you would recommend to automate or track touch point to make sure we're being as efficient as possible with limited time and resources?
Um, Outside, so the tools that I gave, I think will cut down on a lot of time. It does take a bit of a time investment, but it speeds things up dramatically. In terms of other sort of programs, I don't have any that jump off the top of my head. I mean, there's so many CRMs right now, that I'm not 100% sure on. I know which ones I like, which are Razor's Edge, which is a rather sort of more expensive model. I've worked in Salesforce, which can be great. But in terms of for smaller organizations, I'd have to think on that a bit more. I don't know if a great CRM that will be able to automate the way that you'll need, off the top of my head. I think my best advice would be most of them will schedule 30-minute presentations and then read the reviews. I would really like spend time reading the reviews.
Okay. Open for any other questions, either in the chat or you can raise your hand. It looks like there's some recommendations in the chat for Give Butter. Thank you, everyone. Love sharing resources. Okay, I'm going to give one more moment for any other questions that are coming up. No, that was a lot of information, and yes, I'm sure we'll have lots of questions later. And again, we'll be sending all of this out so you can review it on your own time and share it with anyone else that you think might benefit. Okay, well, it looks like we don't have any other questions at the moment, so I am going to pass it back to Ashanti to wrap us up.
Thank you so much, Sierra, and thank you, Caleb, for that wonderful presentation. We are excited to share what's coming up next in our capacity building webinar series. The next webinar, which will be on January 13th, will be on demystifying grant writing for artists. And so this one focuses more on individual artists and grant writing. And so expect several panel guests that will share their insights, and it will offer a practical introduction to finding, reading, and writing for arts grants, and perfect for artists looking to navigate the grant process with confidence. And let's see. So next, please make sure to subscribe to our newsletter. It shares a lot of information on grants and other opportunities that Creative West has, and some other opportunities that might be outside of Creative West as well. And yeah, I think just checking the chat. And then also following this, thank you, Sierra. There's the registration for the capacity building webinar series for next webinar, and you can also register for the rest of the webinar series just by using that registration.